The notification came through at 6:52 on a Tuesday morning, and I almost missed it because I was standing in the parking garage of a hotel in Calgary, trying to get my rental car's Bluetooth to connect before a 9 o'clock meeting with an insurance carrier that had hired me to review a disputed disability claim file. My phone buzzed. The sender was my ex-husband. The subject line read, "Thought you should know before you hear it from someone else." I opened it because I assumed it was about our dog, or the storage unit we'd never formally divided, or one of the leftover administrative threads that don't untangle cleanly after a marriage ends. We had been divorced for 14 months. We still had a joint account I hadn't fully closed because the automatic payments for our old condo strata fees were still routing through it and I hadn't gotten around to switching them. That was my oversight. I know that now. The email was 4 sentences. My ex-husband, I'll call him my ex, because names matter less than what people do, had transferred the remaining balance from that joint account to a personal account in his name only. The balance had been $312,000. That was not strata fee money. That was the savings I had been parking there while I figured out where to move it, a habit left over from when we were married, and that account was our shared operating fund. He had also, in the same week, transferred the contents of a joint investment account we had established during the marriage that I had not yet had retitled. Another $64,000. Then the last sentence, "I've already spoken to a lawyer. You should too." I read it twice. I was standing between a concrete pillar and a silver Mazda with the flame sticker on the bumper. The parking garage smelled like exhaust and damp concrete. My meeting was in 67 minutes. I forwarded the email to my own inbox, put the phone in my jacket pocket, found my rental car, sat down in the driver's seat, and breathed. My name is Joelle Arsenault. I'm 33 years old. For the past 8 years, I've worked in insurance claims investigation, which means I am paid by carriers to find the gap between what someone says happened and what actually happened. I read financial records the way some people read novels, looking for the moment the story stops making sense. I notice when numbers don't match. I notice when timelines are off by a day. I notice when someone is very, very careful about what they put in writing, because careful people who are doing nothing wrong don't usually need to be that careful. My ex-husband was a project coordinator. He was organized and charming and very good at managing logistics. He was also the kind of person who had always believed that whoever moves first wins. I had watched him operate that way in business negotiations, in arguments, in the way he scheduled family events, so that his preferences became everyone's default. What I don't think he had fully accounted for when he decided to move first on this was that I do this for a living. Let me back up. We met in Winnipeg when I was 25, married at 27. By the time I was 31, something had shifted in a way I still don't have clean language for. Not a single event, more like a slow pressure differential, the kind that makes your ears hurt before a storm without you being able to say exactly when the weather changed. We separated in November, and the divorce was finalized the following January, which was fast by most standards. We didn't have children. The asset division was supposed to be straightforward. It wasn't contentious, is what I mean, or it didn't seem to be. He got the condo, I got the vehicle, and a payout. We agreed in principle on the investment account. It was to be retitled in my name once I provided the updated documentation to the broker. I had been slow on the paperwork. I was traveling for work. I kept telling myself I'd handle it on the weekend. My mother had moved in with me after I relocated to a rental in Vancouver following the separation. She said she needed a change of scenery after my aunt passed away. She was 61, healthy, fully independent, but grief does something to people's sense of geography, and I understood that. I had 2 spare rooms. I told her to stay as long as she needed. My younger brother, 4 years younger, the one who had lived with my mother until he was 29, the one she had always organized her worry around the way you organize a room around its biggest piece of furniture, had also needed a soft landing around that time. His contract job had ended. He needed 3 months to get back on his feet. 3 months became 8. Then, a year. I was paying rent, groceries, utilities, and internet for 3 people on a single income, while also managing a consulting practice that required me to travel to Calgary and Toronto and Halifax several times a year. I wasn't resentful about it, not in a clean way. I had invited my mother and I hadn't asked my brother to leave when 3 months became 6. But there was a texture to the household that I found hard to name, the specific feeling of being the person everyone leans on and no one quite sees. I noticed the first odd thing about 9 months before Calgary. My brother had started asking, in the scattered way he asked most things, about how I structured my accounts. He was thinking about setting up an RRSP, he said. Did I use the same bank for savings and checking? Was it a separate institution for my investment accounts? I told him vaguely that I kept things in a few places. I didn't think much of it. Then I noticed mail. 2 pieces in 1 week, resealed with the kind of precision that makes you think you imagined it, except I have a specific way of opening envelopes and the crease was wrong. A bank statement, a letter from my broker. My mother started appearing in the kitchen doorway when I was paying bills at the counter, not asking anything, just present, the way someone is present when they're waiting for information to surface. I told myself she was just lonely. I told myself I was reading into things. The moment it stopped being a suspicion came on a Wednesday evening in March. I'd been away for 4 days on a file in Halifax. I came home to find my brother at my desk, the door not fully closed. Something on the screen that he minimized quickly when he heard my key in the lock. He said he had needed to print something. His face wasn't embarrassed. It was the face of someone interrupted mid-task, not mid-wrong. I didn't say anything. I went to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and held very still for about 3 minutes. Then I called Vivienne Osei. Vivienne is 47, a civil litigation lawyer in Vancouver, with a background in financial disputes and what she describes, in her very quiet way, as a deep professional interest in people who misunderstand how paper trails work. She has a stillness about her that makes everything feel slightly more manageable than it is. When I explained what I'd seen, she didn't express alarm. She said, "How much of your financial picture do they have access to?" I said, "Probably more than I realized." She said, "Then we start now." What happened over the next 7 months was not dramatic in any cinematic sense. It was methodical. It was spreadsheets and phone calls and documentation and the specific patience required to build a case rather than react to one. Vivienne brought in a forensic accountant named Suki. I'll use her first name only, who reviewed my records within 10 days and identified something I had not noticed. Small, irregular transfers over a period of 6 months from the joint account I had maintained with my ex-husband, the account that my ex had technically co-signing access to until I formally closed it. The account I had not closed, the transfers were modest enough not to trigger automated alerts, $800 here, $200 here, $200 there. But the pattern across 6 months was clear. Someone had been probing. Suki called it test activity. She had seen it before. Here's the part people always ask about when I tell this story. Why didn't the bank flag it? Because the account was jointly held. Because the transfers were below the thresholds that trigger automatic review. Because the access was technically authorized. My ex-husband's name was still on the account. He hadn't needed to hack anything or forge anything. He had simply used access I had never formally revoked. The bank had done exactly what banks do, which is process authorized transactions. The legal question was not whether the transactions were technically permitted, but whether they were made in violation of our separation agreement, which specified that joint assets were frozen pending final division. That's a civil matter. Vivienne knew where to file it. While Vivienne and Suki worked on the documentation side, I made my own changes quietly. I removed my ex-husband's name from the Strata fee account and opened a new one. I set up real-time alerts on every remaining account, threshold set to $1. I contacted my broker and formally initiated the retitling of the investment account, something I should have done 14 months earlier, and the delay of which I will not make excuses for, because there are none, only the ordinary human tendency to put off unpleasant administrative tasks. I did not change my behavior toward my brother or my mother. That was the hardest part. I made dinners. I drove my mother to her book club. I asked my brother how the job search was going. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to them talk, and I gave no indication that anything had changed because I needed to understand the full shape of what was happening before I responded to any part of it. The answer came while I was in Calgary. When I got the email in the parking garage, I had already been in contact with Vivian for 7 months. The account documentation was already prepared. The broker flag was already in place. The investment account retilling had been filed 6 weeks earlier, which meant that when my ex-husband attempted to transfer it, he had transferred an account that was, as of that filing date, no longer jointly held. What he believed he had taken, he had not taken. What he believed was his to move had already been moved, legally, to a different title. I sat in the rental car for about 4 minutes. Then I forwarded his email to Vivienne with a single line. It started. Then I drove to my meeting because I had a disability claim file to review and a carrier paying for my time and a claimant whose situation deserved my full attention. I am a professional. I have always understood that keeping things separate, work and crisis, feeling and function, is not coldness. It's how you stay useful to anyone, including yourself. By the time I landed back in Vancouver that Thursday evening, Vivian had filed an emergency injunction with the BC Supreme Court, citing breach of the separation agreement and fraudulent disposition of marital assets. The investment account transfer had already been reversed because the retitling had processed first and the broker's compliance department had flagged the conflicting transaction. The $312,000 joint account transfer had been frozen pending court review. Vivian had anticipated the move and had a motion ready to go before I even landed. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit had been notified, not because Vivian expected them to act immediately, but because having a file number on record changes the texture of negotiations significantly. My ex-husband did not know any of this had been prepared. He had sent that email from what he believed was a position of advantage. He believed he had moved first. He believed I would be calling him in a panic, trying to negotiate from behind. He called on Friday morning. I let it go to voicemail. His lawyer called Vivian on Friday afternoon. That call, Vivian told me afterward, was short. What I came home to that Thursday was not the stripped shell of a house. My situation was different from the kind of physical theft that takes furniture and photographs. What had been taken, or what my ex-husband had attempted to take, was financial. And financial theft, when you have documentation, is recoverable in ways that a cedar chest or a photograph is not. I want to be clear about that because I think people sometimes assume that money being easier to trace makes losing it easier. It doesn't. The $112,000 is a decade of savings. It's the down payment I'd been building toward for a second try at property after losing the condo in the divorce. It's the buffer that makes the solo consulting practice survivable when contracts go quiet. The number is not the point. The dependency is. The civil proceedings took 5 months. My ex-husband's lawyer argued at length that the joint account transfer was within the scope of his authorized access and that the separation agreement language on asset freezing was ambiguous. Vivian had anticipated that argument. Suki's documentation of the earlier test transfers, combined with the timing in the email, thought you should know before you hear it from someone else, which Vivian described to me as the most useful piece of evidence she had seen in 3 years, because it demonstrated intent and premeditation in the sender's own words, made the ambiguity argument difficult to sustain. The settlement came in the form of full restitution of the $312,000, a structured repayment of the 6 months of smaller transfers Suki had identified, and a legal cost contribution. The investment account was already in my name. He was also required to sign a formal acknowledgement filed with the court record that the transfers had been made without lawful entitlement. That last part was Vivian's idea, and I told her it was my favorite part of the entire document. The question of my brother and my mother was separate and quieter. There was no legal component because I could not establish that either of them had taken anything. What they had done, or what I believed they had done, was gather information and pass it to someone who had the account access to act on it. That is very difficult to prove and very painful to sit with. I had a conversation with my mother that I don't intend to recount in detail because it belongs to a part of my life that is not about financial recovery. She moved out in the spring. My brother left 2 weeks later. Neither conversation was clean. I repainted the apartment. I bought a new desk. I found a two-bedroom in East Vancouver that I could afford without a second income in the household. And I signed a lease on a Saturday afternoon by myself, with a coffee from the place on the corner, and I didn't call anyone afterward because there's no one I needed to tell. I recovered 91% of what had been taken or attempted. The missing 9% is legal costs, time, and the specific kind of trust that doesn't reconstitute once it's been converted into evidence. You can't put that in a court filing. You just carry it differently than you used to. My ex-husband did not contact me after the settlement, not once. I think he had believed at some point in the planning of this that I would be too disorganized, too distracted by grief or relocation, too sentimentally tangled in the joint account I'd never closed, to respond with anything other than desperation. He had not considered that my job is to find exactly the kind of pattern he left behind, or that I had been watching something develop in my own financial life for the better part of a year, or that the best preparation for being betrayed is to understand very clearly what you're worth and where it lives. I'll say one thing directly to anyone listening who has ever been told that protecting yourself is a betrayal of someone who loves you. The people who say that are usually the ones who want your protection to be unconditional. They want the love without the accountability. They want access to what you've built without the inconvenience of having built anything themselves. And they rely on a specific assumption that you'll be too ashamed to count carefully, too afraid of being called cold, or suspicious, or difficult to keep your own records. I am not ashamed of counting carefully. I have never been. That is, more or less, what they pay me to do. The new desk faces the window. There's a hydrangea in a pot on the sill that I've managed to keep alive for 4 months, which is longer than I've kept a plant alive in a decade. Every morning I sit down with my coffee and open my files and I do work I'm good at, in a space that belongs entirely to me. That, if you want the honest version of the ending, is what restitution actually looks like. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes after something you've been bracing for finally lands. Not relief exactly, more like the moment a storm you've been tracking on radar actually makes contact with the coast, and you realize the preparations you made were enough. I think about that Tuesday morning in Calgary a lot. The parking garage, the flame sticker on the silver Mazda, the 67 minutes I had before my meeting. I had just read an email that told me my ex-husband believed he had won. And the thing I felt standing there between the concrete pillars was not panic. It was something closer to recognition. That's the part people don't usually expect when I tell this story. They expect rage, or tears, or at least the satisfying arc of immediate revenge. What actually happened was quieter and slower and, I think, more honest. What happened was that the choices I had made over 7 months, the careful ones, the unglamorous ones, the ones that required me to sit with what I suspected without reacting to it yet, those choices had already made the decision for me. All I had to do was forward an email and drive to a meeting. I thought a lot about what made it possible to do that. Part of it was practical. I had Vivian, I had Suki, I had documentation, but I think the deeper thing, the thing that doesn't fit neatly into a legal filing, was that I had spent the better part of a year being honest with myself about what I was seeing, not what I wanted to see, not what was easier to believe, what was actually there. That kind of honesty is harder than it sounds. It would have been simpler to tell myself my brother was just curious about banking, to tell myself the resealed mail was humidity, to tell myself I was being paranoid, suspicious, unkind. There is enormous social pressure on women, especially to interpret warning signs as our own failure of generosity, to extend the benefit of the doubt until there is no benefit left and the doubt has become a certainty you can't afford. I didn't do that. Not because I'm exceptional, but because I had learned, through years of work that required me to look at things as they actually were rather than as people wished them to be, that clarity is not cruelty. Seeing something accurately is not the same as being cold. It is, in fact, the foundation of every good decision I have ever made, professionally and personally. What my ex-husband didn't account for was that preparation and integrity are not opposites. He operated on the assumption that a person who is trusting will also be undefended, that someone who had shared a life with him would be too emotionally entangled to think clearly when it mattered. He was wrong about that. The trust I had extended during our marriage was real. So was the documentation I kept afterward. Vivienne once said to me after the settlement was signed that the cases she finds hardest to win are the ones where the injured party reacted immediately, called, confronted, threatened, gave the other side time to cover their tracks. The cases that resolve cleanly are the ones where someone was patient enough to let the evidence accumulate and deliberate enough to know when to act. I think about that when I sit at my new desk with the hydrangea on the sill that I've kept alive for 4 months now, and I think resilience isn't loudness. It's the ability to keep going through the part that no one sees. The 7 months of quiet preparation, the dinners you make without letting your face change, the work you do at 6 in the morning before anyone else in the house is awake. That invisible stretch is where the outcome is actually decided. The ending didn't happen in a courtroom or in a dramatic phone call. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a Calgary parking garage when I read a message designed to destabilize me, felt the steadiness of everything I had already done, and drove to my meeting. That is what I'll carry forward, not the settlement figure, not the frozen account, the knowledge that when it came to the moment that counted, I had already done the work.